So let's make a start. So yeah, welcome everybody to the sunny Friday afternoon and to the webinar that we are going to be hosting this afternoon to talk about reusing water for non-potable purposes. So this is a study sponsored by the National Framework for Water Resources and published just a couple of weeks ago. And as Water Resources East, we're delighted to host this webinar this afternoon to allow Jeff Darch as the main author of the report, to allow Jane Spencer as the National Framework for Water Resources Independent Chair, the sponsor for this project, to explain the rationale and its kind of key conclusions. But the important thing is, with the people on the call, with the expertise that we've got in the room this afternoon, to think about how best to take this agenda forward. This is Water Saving Week. It's a really, really important week in the calendar for water resources, but let's have a kind of reusing water for non-potable purposes week shortly after this as possibly can, because we also need to bring in not just kind of the major supply side options, the transfers, the kind of leakage control. We need to reuse water and to make it and apply it to non-potable purposes if we're going to manage that water scarcity deficits, particularly in parts of the country like the east of England. But I say, whilst WRE is hosting this call, whilst Anglian Water through Jeff led this work, this is a study of national significance, and I think everyone has an interest in making this project and the recommendations bite and have traction with government, and to take it forward as quickly as possible. So welcome. It's great to have so many people on the call. As I say, I'm Daniel Johns. I'm Managing Director of Water Resources East. And as I say, we're a partner in the project, but mainly just delighted that the work has been done, that's been published, and to have the webinar and to host it for you this afternoon to be able to focus on taking it forward. Quick bit of housekeeping before we start. I assume that most people will have had their microphones switched off and turned to mute. If you could please, just to avoid background noise. But when the time comes for the Q&A sessions later on, we'll be delighted if you want to raise your hand using the usual button to unmute yourself, turn your camera on, and then take part in that interactive session. We've just got the chat working today. Well, actually, we've got Q&A working as well, but probably best just to use the Teams chat to keep it simple. So if you've got questions at any point, please do just put them in the chat, and I'll be keeping an eye on that so that when we come to the panel Q&A, we've got a nice set of questions to kind of kick off with, as well as allowing people to come in and take part too. And to note, you'll have probably seen that when you entered the room that we are recording this afternoon session. We've got the transcript going too, because many people weren't able to make this call this afternoon. So WRE, we will package this up and we will publish it to our webinar library on our website, and we'll also make sure that the slides are available to you as well. So in terms of the agenda, after my quick introduction, I'm going to hand over to Jean Spencer, who's the independent chair of the National Framework for Water Resources. And then the main event is to hand to Jeff Darch, who led the study. He chaired the Non-Potable Re-use Working Group. And there will be time to ask questions to Jeff directly about the study, what it's about, what it says, before we then open it up more widely to our panel of speakers. So we've got Irene Kara, who's a senior lecturer in chemical processes at Cranfield University. We'll welcome George Warren, the integrated water manager at Anglian Water, and we'll have Jeff and Jean actually as part of that panel Q&A. And then just to finish off, handing back to Jean, talk about next steps, maybe talk about the National Framework for Water Resources, and we'll close by around quarter past 3, 20 past 3, something like that. So Jean, I'll hand over to you to take us away.
Great. Thanks, Daniel, and thank you for hosting the webinar. And also, before we get into any detail, massive thank you to Jeff for being a willing volunteer. I don't think we put his arm up his back too far to volunteer to take forward this study on behalf of the National Framework. So next slide, please, Daniel. So a bit on the background and motivation for the study. The recently finalised set of regional water resource plans and the water company water resource management plans have confirmed the significant pressures that all sectors are facing in balancing supply and demand. And we will be issuing the next round of the national framework in mid-June, and that again reaffirms that. And it's showing a deficit in supply-demand balance before taking any action of about 5 billion litres of water a day. So a huge challenge. And that's taking account of the government's top priority for growth. You can't have growth without water, and there is no spare water available. And supplies are already under significant pressure, and there's a need to become more resilient to drought, adapt to climate change, and reduce abstractions to improve and protect the environment. So we're going to need a wide range of solutions at scale to achieve long-term water security. And that includes sources of water that have been less well developed in the UK. The solutions that we're looking at for non-potable reuse, for example, are widely used in other parts of the world, but they are new to the UK, and so they will. There is that need to think about through this study what the potential uses might be, and what standards are needed and regulation to sit behind that. So in November 24, Jeff pulled together the working group of more than 50 stakeholders at a workshop in London representing organisations that could provide, treat or use water that's been recycled. And it was an amazing workshop, ticket-only event, and the many attendees reflected this as a key moment for us to think and start on that journey for establishing water reuse as a widespread solution. So the team carried out a rapid analysis of opportunities and constraints and identified recommendations for further work. So next slide, please, Daniel. So the analysis was published on the 16th of April. There's the summary report, which Jeff is going to take us through, an appendix with the evidence, and a really inspiring set of international best practice that we can all learn from in going on this journey. So that was all I wanted to say at this point as background. Massive challenge, and reuse has to be part of the solution. So Jeff, I think over to you.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Jean. And yeah, good afternoon, everyone. And just a few thanks from me. Thanks to WRE, for Daniel and Alice for hosting this webinar, to Jean and the steering group for all the support you've given us over the past few months, to a fantastic set of colleagues that I've had the privilege of working with on this report, many of whom are on the call today, and to the workshop attendees that Jean mentioned. It was a fantastic and inspiring workshop, and the information that we've gleaned from that and from subsequent conversations that we've had over the past few months have greatly benefited the study that I'm summarising today. So what did we do as part of this? Well, our kind of starting point was to look at what are the potential sources that could be used in a different way. And there are actually lots. They're listed there on the left-hand side. We've basically developed a water system which has got really good at getting rid of water, whether that be rainwater, urban drainage, highway runoff. The priority has been to remove water to prevent flood risk. But actually, with the changing climate, we've got to start thinking about how we might capture and reuse that water. And the other kind of dimension, if you like, on what we've looked at is the different uses of water. And in many cases, we're now reaching the situation where water is not as easily available for these demands as has been the case historically. We've got very used in the UK to having relatively cheap and easily accessible sources of potable water, and we've just ended up using that really rather than thinking about what the alternatives are. But as I say, we're now at that crunch point, the jaws of death, to use James Bevan's language, where we've got to start thinking differently. So what we started doing and as represented on this slide is to look at, well, if we weren't going to treat the water, these sources of non-potable water, or apply very minimal treatment, so for example just screening, how could they be used in these different uses? So we looked at the suitability. We looked at it mainly from a water quality perspective, and that's what the colours represent here. So you can see actually there's quite a lot of low suitability without treatment, some suitability, particularly when you're looking at rainwater and for certain types of uses. But we also looked at the quantity of water, both in terms of the reliability that there would be across the year, as well as the total amount of water that we might see during the year. Then we looked at some minimal levels of treatment that could be applied to the different sources of water. And again, we were very much looking at minimum levels here. Clearly, if you kind of spent an inordinate amount of resources, you can almost polish up any source of water to be used for a whole number of different outcomes. But we were looking and taking the philosophy here of taking these sources, doing the minimum amount of water treatment that was required, and then used. The only exceptions in here are things like sewage effluent, where we already have a system with different levels of treatment, so we adopted that, and things like desalination, which clearly is its own kind of level of treatment. So then we kind of re-looked at that kind of same axes that we had before, and the good news on that is, as you can see here, there's a lot more green. So applying even relatively low levels of treatment means that we can increase the suitability of resources, and there are now more types of use on here that have an acceptable range. And if we look at in summary, what we're saying is that actually all sources have some potential for greater deployment, as I say, especially once subject to treatment. And we've got a slight paradox that the most polluted sources, which are often the most hardest to treat, are often the most available, the most reliable sources from a quantity perspective. There are some real and also some perceived risks associated with a post-treatment product. That means that some sources are less likely to be acceptable. So things like food production, we're probably going to want to carry on using our best sources of water for that, including potable water. And then if we take the other lens, if we look at uses, well, we conclude here that all uses of water could actually be met via alternative sources. Brewing, food processing, as I mentioned, and to a slightly lesser extent, agriculture, they might be the hardest uses to kind of supplement, because water is actually part of the final product. So we've got to take safety very seriously in that case. And also hydrogen production, certainly green hydrogen production, where water is the feedstock for the hydrogen. There is a lot of sense in using things like desalination or another technology like membranes that allow you to reach a very pure source of water. And so what we did then is we then thought, well, actually, what are the most promising sources with treatment that could be adopted in used? And that led to the kind of creation of these use journeys, and you can see those kind of represented on here in the same kind of frame as we had previously. And they're summarized on this slide. So essentially, we can look at this in a number of different kind of groups. So we've got rainwater. We think that can be used via fairly limited treatment for things like a non-potable domestic use. This is widely used in other parts of Europe, for example, to supplement potable use of water for things like toilet flushing. But this could be used for local scale irrigation. Then we can look at domestic grey water. Again, that could be used for things like toilet flushing, and indeed is used in that way in some buildings, particularly overseas. And then we could start looking at things like internal drainage boards. So these very large areas actually of England, not just in the east, but also, for example, in the southwest, where water is essentially collected, or it naturally kind of collects and is then actually pumped out into sea. Well, could we actually kind of use that in a kind of more deliberate kind of fashion? There's also potential to use some industrial effluents, and there's some really good examples in the UK actually of how we can kind of think about, one industrial process as waste becoming another industrial process as a resource. And then if we add treatment in, we can start to think about using things like urban drainage systems, particularly if we deploy some SUDs to start removing things like heavy metals, highway runoff in a similar fashion. And then we can look at sewage effluent, which could be used for a number of different types of uses. It could be used for CCUS or cooling, for recreational irrigation, could even be used for domestic non-potable use. And finally, as I mentioned, combined with the membranes, could be used for hydrogen production. And a kind of final one, and this is one that we kind of added on, following the workshop, was to look at the potential for using mine water. So where water levels in mines is increasing, and actually could we use that rather than that having to be treated and disposed of? Could we actually use that within certain processes? Now, you can probably sort of see from this the sort of workings of a kind of hierarchy, starting from the sort of the rainwater, which is sort of requires minimal treatment, through to more advanced, expensive treatments as we go through. And that I'm just going to skip forward actually, and that really informed this reuse hierarchy that we came up with. We didn't intend to produce this actually as part of the study, but it came out of what our analysis as we kind of reviewed the content. And I suppose the first thing is to note that the reuse hierarchy that we've kind of come up with sits within an overall water use hierarchy. So actually, when we're thinking about using water, demand management, water efficiency should be the number one thing. We should minimize the use of any resource. And this is similar in a number of different hierarchies. Then we believe we should be plugging in the reuse of existing resources into that kind of middle band before we think about abstraction from the environment, or indeed using potable water, which of course itself relies on abstraction from the environment. So we have that kind of water hierarchy. And then we've kind of looked at producing a reuse hierarchy. And this really starts by looking at, well, rainwater. I mean, it falls everywhere. We can collect it on roofs. We've got urban drainage systems, highway runoff. They're all things that we should look at first. Then we can move into things like localized building scale reuse, so grey water, for example. And then finally, we get to single point sources, which often require additional treatment. But also, these sources are not necessarily available everywhere. Even sewage treatment works, water recycling centres, tend to relate to more urban areas, and obviously the larger of those, and therefore the greater volume availability is in our larger urban areas. Similarly, things like internal drainage board water, potentially very useful, but not geographically available everywhere, and so on. So this has become kind of our reuse hierarchy, which we've set out in the report. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to skip back to look at the current barriers to reuse. So what we were keen to do at this stage was to say, well, we've identified these 16 most promising use journeys. Actually, what is going to prevent us from taking these forward? And we looked at barriers in terms of economic factors, social factors, technological factors, legal and regulatory, and environmental. One of the interesting things that we concluded was actually there are very few technological barriers to deploying this water. In fact, the international best practice review, which Jean referred to, proved this point, that actually most of these technologies are being used elsewhere in the world, including in countries with very strict environmental and safety standards. So the technology is there. And actually, what we were looking at here is more kind of economic and environmental barriers that really need kind of working through for specific use journeys, or indeed it might just be that they need working through for specific locations where they may be employed. So we also, through this, identified, you can see those question marks on the graph here. We also identified that there were some uncertainties. There are some things where we just didn't have the evidence to know how much of a barrier this could be, and actually what it would take to overcome those barriers. Now, all of the barriers we've then kind of fed into a set of recommendations. So, we believe that these barriers can be overcome, and we believe that these use journeys present really excellent opportunities to, at scale, increase the uptake of recycled water. So what are we saying? We've got 12 recommendations, and I'll just run through those quickly before we get into the Q&A. So the first recommendation is that we really need to recognise non-potable reuse within the national framework for water resources, which, as Jean mentioned, is being refreshed and will be published next month. And it is, I believe, going to be recognised within there as a significant source. One of the questions that has been asked of us as we've kind of got to the concluding stage of this is, how significant is that source? And we can add up the different sources, and we know we can kind of get to a big number, but we need to do some more work on that to look at what's realistically deployable from that. And we need to do that in conjunction with other activities that are going on. So we've got the strategic resource options, we've now got local resource options, and water companies are now going through the next cycle of looking at options for the 2029 water resources management plan. So we need to look at this in conjunction with those kind of processes. The water reuse hierarchy, as I said, was a slightly unexpected outcome of this, but a really useful one. And we'd love to see that taken up by government, by the Environment Agency, Ofwat, water companies, and other stakeholders, such as developers. We really need to kind of get into that thinking around using the resources that we have, starting with rainwater and then kind of working down at the hierarchy. Now, often the thing that will sort of make this happen, and one of the kind of definite barriers that we identified is the kind of economics, this kind of argument that it's too expensive to do reuse and to increase the uptake. We believe that this is changing anyway, because we're now no longer in a situation of we're just comparing it with the price of water that you will kind of get from your taps. We're actually now moving into a much more of a kind of scarcity type economics, where it might just be a choice of doing this or not doing the development that you are interested in. But nonetheless, there are some specific things that we think could be taken forward. So we can look at evaluation of treatment technologies, how cost is likely to decline over time as uptake increases. We need to look at potential roles for grants or subsidies, which have been very successful in the energy space, for example, in terms of getting solar PV and other larger scale developments going. There may be the role of a credit system, and this is being actively considered in the case of Cambridge at the moment. And we may need to produce case studies. The Enabling Water Smarts Communities project, which George Warren may talk a little bit about later on, has developed some useful sort of economic arguments through this, which really can help people understand that actually the uptake is not as expensive as you might think. We've also identified the need for further research on the acceptability of reuse. Most of the work that's been done on this to date has been very domestic focused for obvious reasons, but actually we need to look at, are there acceptability issues? Are there kind of other issues for industry, for recreation, and for agriculture? And then we can look at how they can be overcome. Another kind of angle that we looked at in that kind of regulatory and legal column was the clarification regarding the definition of waste. This is a hugely kind of complex area. It's something that the Environment Agency have a very major role in. And when we've got into those discussions, we've got into considerations of things like, well, what's a waste? What's actually a product? What's a byproduct of a process? When do we reach end of waste? So we believe that we need to develop some guidance on this in order to help people through that regulatory process. Related to this, we think it's important that we develop a set of what I call model arrangements for permitting. So the permitting process can seem quite confusing from the outside. And I think for the use journeys that are likely to require new permits, we would like to establish a set of arrangements with the Environment Agency that the National Permitting Service can feel comfortable to use when people come up. One of the barriers that we have at the moment is that this feels quite new and therefore takes a long time for each case to be considered. We need to kind of get through that. Case studies and possibly even pilot projects will definitely kind of help that. actually, the more we've kind of looked at this, we've realised that there's a lot more happening in the UK than we might realise. We just don't talk about it. If we're going to move to a much greater use of recycled water, we are going to need to look at standards. We're going to need to look at training and quality assurance. Within the report, we've published a short section on standards, which has borrowed heavily from the Enabling Water Smart Communities project. Actually, we think that pretty much all the standards we would need are already out there, and they may need some kind of tailoring, but it's not like there's a deficit of there. What we would need, if we were going to adopt some of these things on scale, is more training. We need quality assurance, and linked to the next point around ensuring that we're going to maintain these systems as we go forward. And these two recommendations 8 and 9, are going to need the involvement of a much larger stakeholder kind of community involving organizations such as the Health and Safety Executive, local authorities, training providers, standards bodies. Now, recommendation number 10 is looking at the supply chain needs. So again, it's going to link to those maintenance needs. There's no point in us having a kind of revolution in this if it's not going to stick. So we need to understand how these things can be maintained over time. Recommendation number 11 relates to the fact that we've come at this from a water resources angle. We are looking at this from the problem of not having sufficient water resources and looking at alternative sources. But actually, there's a huge number of additional benefits that we can gain from doing this. So, for example, we could be remediating poor water quality sources that otherwise people might walk away from. We can look at nature-based solutions, so to deliver benefits for biodiversity alongside production of water. And the final recommendation really is to continue the collaborative approach that was kicked off with that fantastic workshop we held last November, where we were quite frankly blown away by the interest that we had, both from potential providers of water, but also lots of different users. We could have had many more people to that workshop. We just simply kind of ran out of space. So we know there's interest there, and we want to continue that collaborative approach into the way we take this forward. And at that point, I think, Daniel, I'm handing back to you for any questions on the report.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Jeff. I'm just going to check the chat again, so I'll come to that in a moment. I just thought to kind of start you off, Jeff. So in terms of what the response has been, you published a report a month or so ago. What's been the immediate reaction, potentially from government, from regulators, from other kind of people involved in this kind of sector?
Yes, it's been really kind of positive. I think there is a recognition that this is a moment in time. It's interesting with the weather that we're experiencing at the moment. The very dry spring, probably going to be the driest spring on record for almost 200 years in most, if not all, of the country. So this is actually feels like a kind of right here, right now activity. And certainly in a lot of the discussions that I'm having day to day, people are really kind of wanting to know kind of how we could start delivering some of their stuff. And it's why I think within the recommendations, there are some in there that we've just got to get on with. I mean, things like the model permitting arrangements, getting the legal definitions right. There's a huge appetite to kind of drive this forward.
Yeah, and it's an absolutely huge opportunity, because there's examples of kind of crazy use of potable water. I mean, we talk about data centers, artificial intelligence using potable water for cooling, because it's, as you say, has at least in the past been really available and is the cheapest means to keep data centers cool. But we've also heard that race courses use potable water to water the track to keep it soft enough for horse racing. The single largest user of potable water in the country, I think it's a refining. Massive industrial refining that uses potable water for cooling tanks, and then that water just goes into the combined sewer and then just gets treated along with everything else. So part of it is creating demand for non-potable water, and part of it, of course, is creating the supply for it. So to what extent, or at least maybe looking elsewhere around the world, is it markets that help unlock some of this? Is the goal here is to create a market for non-potable sources of water? Or is it, what do you see as the immediate next steps?
Yes, I mean, it's been driven internationally a lot by scarcity. And that, you know, if you look at places like California, Singapore, where water security is also a very significant issue, you know, it's been driven out of necessity in many cases, but actually has also been then hugely successful. And it's still, you know, if you look at the, you know, the per capita consumption in Belgium, for example, at 84 liters per head per day, that, you know, they've achieved that through water reuse. You know, they're flushing the toilets with collected rainwater, not with potable water. If you look at, you know, Singapore with its new water system, where they're actually doing direct reuse, you know, is enabled them to be water secure. So there's a huge number of kind of benefits. And I think, you know, now that we're kind of at this point where we're kind of running out of water, we need to think really kind of creatively and really kind of hard about, you know, are we using water for the right things? And, you know, especially with new demands, like you say, with data centers, we've just got to be really clear.
Yeah. Well, so one question we've got in the chat talking about the Mining Remediation Authority. So we met with several people from the Mining Remediation Authority recently, and they were talking potentially about huge amounts of water that they need to deal with in order to keep kind of the aquifers that are used for drinking water and other purposes, you know, safe from contamination. So have you know, obviously it was part of the study, but have you considered that they already treat a lot of that water to a standard to be able to release it to the environment? So to what extent are you already factoring in the treatment that may be performed on things like mine water?
Yes, exactly. So, for example, sort of removal of iron and the high iron content is already being kind of looked at. I think what we're keen to understand through this study is kind of where that water could be kind of pointed at, because, you know, the benefit, if you like, to any kind of use is not being factored in. You know, the mine water benefits are not factored into the kind of environmental flow target. So this is kind of new water, if you like, and actually, you know, where could we deploy it? Yes, there might be some immediate benefits to the environment. That's great, obviously, but actually, could we point this water at other uses? Could we create new non-potable zones where we could suggest industry comes and houses itself?
Yeah. Yeah, brilliant. Well, just as a reminder, as part of this session, actually, as part of the panel Q&A to follow, I'm hoping people will be able to put their hands up and join us. But Alice, would you mind just checking whether or not people are able to unmute themselves? Because it looks as though people's microphones might be disabled. If you could maybe check that in the background. Yeah, thanks, Alice. But yeah, so there's a question here about, you know, are there any immediate next steps, Jeff? I mean, is there a plan to carry this forward, or is that partly what this webinar is about?
I mean, both of those things. So the working group is going to stay, and we're looking to supplement membership of that. So we'd definitely be interested in hearing from people on the call. We've already had one or two people approach us over the last month or so. And so there's potentially quite a big program of work here if you look at the number of different recommendations. So we might form some task and finish groups to look at that. We've already kicked off a really interesting set of conversations with the Environment Agency around the legal definition end of waste and the model permitting and so on. So yeah, it's going to kind of branch out into a number of things, a number of different areas. We're, you know, like I say, we're very keen to hear from people, which is in part of the purpose of the webinar today.
Yeah, perfect. All right, well, should we move on to the panel Q&A? Let's introduce Irene and George, and welcome back Jean as well to the panel if you want to switch your cameras on. Just whilst you're doing that, because you say that it feels like there's a huge win-win here, because we talk about places like Cambridge, we talk about places across the country that have got absolutely massive housing growth, non-household growth. They will need more potable water, but that also creates more treated effluent. So how do we tap into that treated effluent in order to displace some of that increase in potable water in the first place? But Irene, should I ask you to introduce yourself first? You want to say, yeah, what's your interest in this, and what's your perspectives on the report?
Thank you very much, and hi to everyone. It's a great review that Jeff has provided. I'm very keen on the discussion now with the panel. So I'm a senior lecturer in chemical processes at Cranfield University. My field of expertise is around processes and technologies that improve water quality and assessing how these processes can help us achieve the target that we need, particularly in my case in drinking water scenarios and frameworks.
Brilliant. Thank you. Great to join us. And George.
Good afternoon, all. So George Warren, I'm the Integrated Water Manager at Anglian Water. I also came up with and are still working quite heavily on the Enabling Water Smart Communities project, which is an Ofwat innovation project looking at trying to break down the barriers to integrated water management in new residential development. And I have to admit, I'm really an advocate of water reuse in general and trying to push that on, one of which I'm trying to bang the drum on is around final effluent reuse. But I'm sure we'll get onto that.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. I can see that Alice has worked her magic, and it looks as though microphones have been enabled if anyone does want to put their hand up and join the call and ask questions directly to our panel. But I was going to start just about maybe ask both of you, Irene and George, about the acceptability. So one of the recommendations is to do further work on the acceptability of using different alternative sources of water for particular uses. So Jeff, you always use the example of, is it Singapore that uses treated effluent to make beer? Would that ever go down well in this country? I mean, so what do we know about the limits, I suppose, of public acceptability for some of these different uses? Irene, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think one of Jeff's key points in the presentation was around building case studies, and that is very closely linked to acceptability, I think. So while there are many cases worldwide about reusing water in different ways and for different purposes, and we know the US, Australia, many countries are ahead of the game when it comes to reuse, I think each country needs to develop their own strategy. The UK is very different from Australia and from the needs that country might have in terms of reuse. So those case studies are great to see how things might work, but it might not necessarily be directly applicable to the UK, for example. And I think breaching that barrier of acceptability here has a lot to do with building our own case studies. And you know, the report that has been published reviewing all the journeys for reuse, that's very much applied to us, to the UK. And I think is building on that report, what are the first examples that we can build in terms of case studies to bring confidence to people that this is an option that can work.
Yeah, brilliant. And George?
Well, I'll refer to a piece of work that we did through Enabling Water Smart Communities, where Public First carried out a public survey of over 4,000 UK residents, asking for their understanding of the water resources challenge, which was fairly low, I might add. But we got onto reuse and acceptability within a domestic setting. Really high acceptability of rainwater in particular, like over 80% of those 4,000 people were interested in using rainwater within a domestic setting, principally around the sort of flushing of toilets and the irrigation. But actually, they looked at grey water as well, and that was quite high acceptability. I apologise now for the background noise. I don't know if it's coming through, but for some reason, in this cafe, they've decided they're going to wash the cutlery very loudly. So.
That's absolutely fine. Of course, rainwater and dishwashers, that's a thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. On the domestic setting, one of the key areas that we were looking at is WC flushing, washing machine use, and external taps, on the basis that by doing that, we can reduce down by over 30% the domestic water use. In a commercial setting, we've seen lots of examples of this across the UK and globally of alternative water resource. I think the issue is often the reliability element, and also that we look at a single source often as the only source. So they often will look at rainwater and say, is there a sufficient quantity of it in order to meet my demand? If there isn't, then they move on. And what we're asking through this hierarchy is, rather than not doing it, moving on to the next, actually going, right, well, let's maximize the amount of rainwater, and then let's look to supplement it with an alternative source as well, rather than just going for a single source.
Yeah, brilliant. Jeff, Jean, jump in at any point if you want to come in. But I was going to just talk about, incentives, and I guess then we'll talk about regulation, because part of the challenge here is, as Jeff said, potable water has just been cheap and readily available, at least in the past. And so it's the simplest, easiest answer for anyone, whether you're a householder or whether you're setting up a new business. So and because water is so cheap, as a consequence of that, the payback period on any investment in rainwater harvesting, in kind of stormwater attenuation, getting into like sewage effluent reuse, the payback period never stacks up. So part of it is how do we make that financial equation more beneficial, more at least of a kind of a finer balance, as opposed to what happens at the moment. It just never stacks up.
So I can maybe start adding to that a little bit, and maybe say that part of the challenge is that water is taken for granted almost as a resource that, like you say, it's always there, but it's not the case really. And maybe one of the steps to take this forward and change perspective to customers, policymakers, is around putting facts and figures to the challenge. So we've been discussing the reuse hierarchy and how that will play a role in prioritizing where to do reuse first, where the demands are. Well, actually, can we build on that pyramid and put actual numbers in terms of, well, this is what we have available, this is what we actually need, which Jeff's team has done a brilliant job at putting together. But can we add to that and say, well, there are costs associated to this. If we don't do anything, this is what it will look like if you want to drink water from your tap. If we do and put in place reuse strategies, this is how we will get better and how it will look like. And I think this just framing the reality of the problem that we have.
Yeah, exactly. And putting numbers, you say, kind of real world examples of the opportunities, and starting to put some numbers to them too. But so part of it for me is, we need to find a way that's politically acceptable to make potable water, particularly for non-household users, more expensive. And one of the things that WRE responded to the Cunliffe Independent Water Commission about was, let's at least end the idiocy of falling block tariffs for non-household users, where the largest commercial industrial users of potable water pay less per cubic meter than the local hotel, the restaurant, or the hairdresser. So I can see George has got his hand up. In fact, Jean, you were in first. So Jean, do you want to come in on this?
Great. Thanks, Daniel. I think a couple of points. So one, as Jeff mentioned, is that economics of scarcity. So many industrial business users and data centers are coming to water companies, and there is no water available. So that is forcing them to look at other solutions. But I think what we can do at a national level is work with them to take them through that journey and get them to understand that water is scarce. I think there's been assumptions across the board, including in energy, that water is freely available. And I think now, through the national framework, we are getting that message across. This study is focused mainly on non-domestic uses, and that primarily is because enabling water smart communities is focused on the domestic setting. And within that, there are studies and looking at incentives for developers to adopt non-potable reuse for that toilet flushing and so on. And George can say more about that, because more closely involved in that work. But a couple of things. Thanks.
Yeah. George, you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, sure. So we've done a piece of work that looked at the cost of incorporating reuse at a range of scales within residential settings, and broad brushly. If you were to look at stormwater harvesting, then you're looking at somewhere in the region of about £2,000 per dwelling of additional cost associated with that, of which about £350 worth of that is around the internal pipe work. And if you're looking at grey water, it's around the £4,000. Now, I appreciate those. What we're talking about here is residential, and obviously that varies quite dramatically when it comes to commercial. One of the things that we're working on with commercial customers at the minute within Anglian is looking at the carrying out of kind of ostensibly audits of their water use within commercial processes, and coming up with recommendations off the back of those audits as to what water demand management techniques they could incorporate. Off the back of that, almost giving them a time frame in which to carry out some of those recommendations, and failure to do so will see a change in the tariff requirements. We're trialing that as an alternative to kind of drive that behaviour of water demand management, which would include the potential to look at alternative resources in that. Right. Now, that could be one route by which to drive it, and I could say that's a pilot that we're looking at them right now. But it's, you know, we need, I don't think we truly understand the cost each time. I think the viability aspect is often straight away used, and that's why we haven't done it. But as Jean and Jeff have previously pointed out, you know, lack of water resources is going to push us down this route. So when they approach the water company and ask for any new or an upgrade to their water provision, ultimately we say, look at that hierarchy. You know, you need to show how you're utilising that first before you can even think about potable water. So it's not a case of potable water is cheaper. We don't have that available and that luxury available anymore. The interesting one is the retrofit side and how we encourage them on the retrofit, where those incentives need to come in. And as Jean said, the environmental incentive program for domestic use is in place for residential, and we have the ability to police that, doing a similar one for the non-household. I think we need to explore that a little bit better though for the retrofit side.
Yeah, but that puts you, that makes you the bad guys all the time, that you're having to refuse the data center, the large industrial user, the massive food and drink manufacturer setting up shop in the kind of the most water scarce part of the country. I mean, should there be certain water uses that simply should be banned?
I mean, water companies, bad guys, come on. That's surely not the current narrative. Now, you're right, Daniel, that I think we need to be really clear as to exactly what uses are more appropriate for the location. And that's shadow. But I think we need to also be clear around what those uses. When we talk about data centers vary hugely in terms of their water demand, and they can be designed to have very minimal water demand. And it's about making sure that those users are aware of the water shortages at the outset, rather than way down the line when the design is already carried out and they're just asking for that connection, which is often the case. So I think the more that we educate the public, and I can refer back to that 4,000 people that we surveyed that had very little understanding of the water resources challenge, the more we can educate them over the water scarcity, then that can be built into designs. You know, and it's not that people aren't willing to go down this route. We have lots of people approaching us about final effluent reuse. There's current barriers to doing that. But yeah, I think we need to, it's the education, the fact that water, you can't just turn up at the point at which you're wanting to turn on your battery to that connection to assume that you're going to get that water. It needs to be, they need to be educated as to what the water resources challenges are and what use may be most appropriate here.
Yeah, Irene, I was going to come to you. So yeah, what do you think?
It's just a comment on actually what you've said about water utilities being the bad guys again. I actually think, for this to work, this has to be a national effort, and it has to go hand in hand with policy. It cannot be, left to utilities to, like you say, ban certain uses and direct this effort. For this to work, it truly needs to have a true group of stakeholders who really input and drive this change. It is something too big just to leave to utilities on their own on this. So, but it's been actually a good perception, your comment about, otherwise utilities are always the responsible ones for the negative impact on society and customers when it comes to water. Yeah.
Well, I guess Jeff, we made a start because that's what the hierarchy is. It's basically saying, do you really need to have direct abstraction or use of potable water when actually water efficiency or non-potable reuse might be part of the answer? But yeah, do you have any thoughts about, I guess, how do you move from the hierarchy more towards kind of standards and kind of protocols and best practice, where it's pretty obvious what types of water should be used for different purposes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's steps in the process, right? So, as George has referred to, the kind of economics make this work really well at development scale from the domestic side of things. So, with a target to build 1.5 million new homes over the next 5 years or so, given that a lot of these are going to be in kind of new towns or urban extensions, we have a kind of aggregated demand here. And similarly, when we're looking at some of the industrial demand, they're often kind of aggregated in specific economic clusters and so on. So, we can create that demand, which is necessary, I think, as kind of part of this. And then I think we can in those using those kind of case studies and effectively they're the kind of use journeys coming through, we can develop the standards associated with that. So on the domestic one, we know that obviously we need to be super careful not to have any kind of cross connections. There's a whole kind of education piece there around customers, plumbers, and so on and so on. But it's perfectly possible other countries are doing this without lots of downside kind of health risks. Similarly, that we need to decide what standards are required in other settings. We have a lot of this stuff already. I mean, if you look at things like reusing sewage effluent and putting that to land for whatever, whether that's for for greens or playing surfaces or whatever, the regulations are kind of there. What I think is not clear is kind of what applies in what circumstances, how do people go about doing that, and that's why what's becoming increasingly apparent is we need to develop some guidance to help people through this process. We just need to make it a lot more straightforward to do this.
Yeah, Jean, let's turn to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think as we're saying, that through the national framework and the national framework team and the DEFRA team have been working closely with MHCLG, DESNZ, and the Ministry for Business and so on to get across the message around water scarcity and the need to think about this at the start of planning. So as George was saying, it's about understanding in deciding on location, design, processes and so on, rather than having gone through planning and the connections are not there. So I think we are seeing some early steps of that. I think also in the Sir John Cunliffe review that you mentioned, Daniel, I think we've all tried to get across that we need to look at a multi-sector planning. So we've talked about the particularly planning for housing growth and business growth and so on, but for agriculture as well. And we're all depending on the same sources of water. So I think in thinking about how planning might develop, we need to look at multi-sector and we need government to be joined up. And I think that message is getting across. So we'll see. But yeah, let's have our fingers crossed that there is that recognition there at the start of the process and in planning.
Yes, I mean, there absolutely is a joined up government thing here. I mean, for example, is there sufficient dialogue within government about where the new towns are going? It does seem as though there's quite a few new towns that are earmarked for the east of England. Is there not only sufficient kind of water resources, but also water recycling capacity in those places? I mean, when DESNZ announced some of the early green hydrogen projects, and maybe I'll bring Jenna in on this, some of the earlier green hydrogen projects, they were along the kind of Norfolk-Suffolk coast. And obviously green hydrogen relies on a relatively resilient, abundant supply of potable water, if not desal. And then I'm not sure whether or not DESNZ knew to think or to ask DEFRA about, is there sufficient water in order to justify taxpayer funding going into some of those green energy projects. But I probably should stop talking about stuff I know very little about and bring in the experts like Jenna. Jenna, can you turn your microphone on, introduce yourself?
Hi, so there'll be many people on the line who know me, but if you don't, my name's Jenna Lyons. I work for Uniper. It's a power company. So we are in the process of developing low carbon power and hydrogen production projects. So the government is providing revenue support for low carbon developments on the South Humber Bank, things like just what I've said, like low carbon power and hydrogen production projects. And there's already a lack of water for industry in this area, as many of you will already know. These projects are meant to be contributing to the UK net zero target, but they simply won't be able to go ahead if they don't get access to the water that they need. And it's just like Daniel was saying, that the circle hasn't been closed. You've got one government department providing effectively subsidies to build a plant that won't be able to go ahead unless another department makes sure that there is water that they've got access to water. I'm not saying it has to come from a water company. So we're very keen on reuse of effluent in the South Humberbank area. There are actually, I think I've counted up 6 people from the company that I work for on this call, which is probably an indication of how important and how keen we think we are. And I know Jeff has mentioned the waste issue. That's probably, it's not a complete barrier, but it's something that we want to get sorted out. It would be much more convenient if it wasn't classed, if reuse of effluent wasn't classed as a waste. It's probably not a showstopper for us, but it would be a showstopper for much smaller companies. So yeah, that's all I had to say, really. I don't know.
No, thank you, Jenna. No, that's really, really useful. And it's great to know that the energy sector, obviously, I know this, but to others to hear that you are, actively pursuing these kind of options. That this is potentially part of the answer for places like the South Humberbank.
Another problem we have is the whole confidentiality competition law thing, and that there will sometimes be things that companies are talking about behind the scenes that they simply can't talk about in a public meeting.
Okay, so you're not prepared to divulge exactly where Uniper's projects are going?
Well, no, actually, we've got 2. So we've got a couple of projects that are in the public domain up there. So and I've sent that information to Water Resources East as well. So it should be in your system somewhere.
No, it is. I'm sorry, it's only because we're recording this. Let's go on the website, so you know. Brilliant. Well, thank you for joining us. And actually, there's another question in the chat from Simon, who is chair of the Bedford and Milton Keynes Waterway Trust. So promoting a new canal, essentially to join the Grand Union Canal to the Great Ouse, the River Great Ouse through Milton Keynes and Bedford. Because part of the question here is, will the effluent, let's just take treated effluent as an example, will that recycled water be available where it's needed, or if not, how do we transport treated effluent? And also to pick up the mine remediation authority point that mines aren't necessarily near urban centres where the demand for non-potable water sources are. So how do we transfer it to where it's needed? Who wants to go first? Irene?
Yes, I can do. So there are examples of that, not for reuse, but actually for drinking water. Already, the Anglian Water are leading transferring water north to south of their region, and Jeff will be able, and George, to talk a lot more about that than myself. But through work in collaboration with Cranfield, we know that work is well underway and is a way to. We know there's already a challenge transferring water from one place to another, from high demand. From a place where there is a lot of water to a high demand place where there is not enough water. So I think, well, it is a logistic challenge. There are ways around that, whether that's through nature-based systems or more infrastructure built systems. I think there's definitely a way forward, and it shouldn't be a stopper from these sort of solutions, I think.
Yeah. Does anybody else want to come in on that about making sure the water's where it's? Yeah, Jeff?
Yes, I mean, this is a classic problem of water resources, right? I think nationally we absolutely have enough water. I mean, even in the driest locations, we're still getting 50, 60 centimeters of rainfall per year. So redistribution is a key part of this, and essentially, I think what we're looking at in some cases is just supplementing what happens with our river system at the moment. There's a lot of talk at the moment, particularly in the light of the Cunliffe Review, around a kind of national grid for water. I think that's a complete misnomer, but I think actually a more useful discussion is to think about where can we make new connections that help this issue, help get the water that we need in the kind of right places. And things like canal transfers, and obviously the Grand Union Canal transfer is one of these strategic resource options. But as Simon has mentioned, is there kind of a further kind of link up? Are all things that we should be considering? And it's a bit like with the mine water, as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of like, where do we want to point this resource to in order to kind of get the maximum benefits? So I think it is something that we need to look at. The kind of the barrier the main barrier to this actually is around, are we inadvertently moving non-native invasive species from one catchment to another, and I suppose what's the kind of proportional response to that risk? That's one of the challenges we've got at the moment.
Yeah. George, and then I'll bring Nicola in. George.
Yeah, sorry. So I think one of the issues, and I am going to hone in on reuse of effluent, if honest, is I don't think anyone knows whether the availability is of effluent. I would love for us to devise that methodology so we can really assess where is availability and to the scale of it. Almost a RAG status map that gives you an idea of the quantum of available final effluent, so that those in close proximity could potentially utilize it and potentially free up capacity on the potable system for others elsewhere. So they're not, almost reducing down the need for huge transportation of final effluent and lights. I do really like Simon's point there with regards to utilizing the waterways. The other thing I wanted to add around your costings piece is, as recommendation 11 in the report says, we have only looked at this from a water resources perspective. There are other benefits associated with reuse. And if we can start joining up the dots between, the benefit from a drive overflow, for instance, drive overflow capacity, as well as, the final effluent as a resource, then actually you start to see, almost, a combination of funding sources in to make it financially viable. And I think we need to be really clear as to where there is an attractive proposition from a water company to invest in final effluent reuse compared to other areas. It may well be cheaper in those areas compared to the others where there isn't as less of an interest. So I think the more we can get that out there, the better.
But George, you've shown me maps of where all Anglian Water's water recycling centres are. You've done analysis which shows how close some of those are to golf courses, to potential. So, if you don't know where this water might be.
So I think this is where we need a sensible conversation across all bodies around the methodology for assessing availability. We took an approach which looked at abstraction availability in that water body and used that as a metric for whether they would be able to almost reduce down the final effluent discharge. It turns out that was not an acceptable metric to utilize from the agency's perspective, but there doesn't seem to be an alternative at the minute. And what I'd really like to do is work with the Environment Agency, and I'm sure many people on this call, to really come out with what is the methodology for assessing availability. And yes, okay, we appreciate it's going to be more available on the coast where it's going out to marine environments, but there must be, certainly with growth coming on board, and for those certain instances, huge amounts of additional final effluent, surely we can look at trying to divert a percentage of that for that reuse of those opportunities. Because at the minute, we don't actually have an agreed methodology nationally as to how to assess the quantum and whether it is available. And without that, it's a completely opaque process, which results, in people having to invest quite a large sum of money if they're interested in reuse, without any idea as to whether it's going to be, anywhere close to being successful or not.
Yes. Brilliant. Right. Well, let's bring in Nicola first. Yeah. Can you unmute and introduce yourself?
Maybe higher up here as well. That might help. Hi, I'm Nicola Smith. I'm the head of environment for SSE Thermal, which is a power company. But really, I was just picking up on Jeff's comment about final effluent reuse and whether it's a waste or not, because I see that is something that actually is important to work on and get resolved quite quickly, whether in the power sector we would want to use reuse, which we are interested in, but also I think, the more it can be moved forward, i.e., you look at how many houses are being built, etc., and golf courses. If we can resolve this and help others use potable water reuse as well, then actually that leaves more for the environment and more for the users. So it was kind of a question as to, is that going to be done through the working group that went to the original workshop, or how's that going to, because I do think it needs to have multi-sectoral engagement, obviously with the Environment Agency as well, but if not, we'll potentially miss the boat and all these houses will be built, and we might not have actually benefited.
Yeah, no, indeed. So yeah, probably for Jeff first, and then but others come in too. Because you've talked about standards, you've talked about guidance, you've talked about model arrangements. But how do we get to a system where, almost like the biosolids assurance scheme, there is a means by which people can confidently investigate, invest in these kinds of options, and know that there is a decent chance of them being kind of improved through the regulatory process, whatever that happens to be. Yeah, Jeff.
Yeah, brilliant. No, thanks, Nicola. Yeah, I mean, I say we've kicked off some good discussions on this already, including with Matt Davis, who's introduced himself in the chat from the Environment Agency, who's a real expert in this area. So we're going to have a sort of task and finish group around this. We'd really love it if you or others from the energy sector would be part of that, because obviously we want to make this work for everyone. So yeah, I mean, it is important. We're definitely going to take this forward, and we can already see some kind of good routes through this actually. So I'm feeling positive, based on the conversations we've had. So yeah, let's join up on it.
Yeah,
it doesn't feel hard, does it? It feels like let's define for ourselves a standard for non-potable water that's of sufficient quality to be able to be used for multiple purposes. Not every type of agricultural use, not every type of domestic use, but certainly for a wide range of different uses. And then once that standard is set and accepted, then we can work to it.
Yeah, and Daniel, just to add on that, I mean, there's a big difference between, say, using recycled water in another product, and that becoming a product rather than it being a waste.
Yeah.
Versus, say, for example, the final effluent going to land, when you're starting to introduce considerations around groundwater protection and so on. So this is why the kind of individuality of each use journey is actually really, really important. And almost each of those use journeys will have a very specific interaction with the regulations that exist, and indeed exemptions in some cases as well. So yeah, Nicola, I don't know if it'll be you or Jenna or who from the energy industry, but very happy to work with you on this.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, we'll definitely support that.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Right, let's got about 5 minutes left if people want to ask questions either in the chat or to put their hands up. But Heather, let's bring you in, and then John afterwards.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Heather Smith. I'm also at Cranfield University. I work with Rena. Apologies to George and if you think I'm a slightly broken record on this, but just coming back to some of those regulatory challenges. I mean, Daniel, you hinted at a standard for non-potable. I think this is something we've been chatting about for ages, but I think one of the challenges there is that it's not one, it's multiple standards, as Jeff said about these different use cases. And that makes kind of the oversight of those standards, those quality standards for different purposes, quite important. And where do we think we're ending up with the regulatory oversight of those quality standards? So we've talked about the end of waste thing. That's a regulatory challenge in itself. But when it comes to the use, ultimately there has to be regulatory oversight of some description about managing the assurance of that quality of the water to those standards. I know there's been a shift in DWI's position on this, but is that the direction where we want to go? No disrespect to DWI, they're wonderful at what they do, but the emphasis is on the D, in my opinion, for DWI. So is there another model that we could look at besides DWI looking at moving into non-potable, especially because for them, that would mean shifting to some of these industrial use cases, which just seems really out with their scope. So I'm just wondering if there's other models that we could think about.
Yeah, brilliant question. Who wants to come in on this? I saw Jeff or Aaron.
Yeah. I mean, Irene would no doubt have some really good technical insight into this, but I suppose just from a kind of sort of our understanding of kind of user perspectives, one of the things that we're acutely aware of is that there are already some really good and very specific standards that already exist. So, for example, if you need demineralized water for a certain industrial process, that is very well prescribed by kind of international standards. So, I think there are some things where actually that's kind of done. There are definitely some grey areas in here, and where we might need to look at kind of new standards. And I think it's a bit like with some of the kind of the conventional kind of water resource stuff here. It is a sort of slightly a bit of a mix between the environment agencies and DWI. Local authorities have a role in this. So there might be some kind of rationalisation, or at least a kind of preferred route that we could do it here, rather than kind of add to the slight morass of all organisations we've got at the moment.
Interesting. I'll bring in Jean before John. I've got loads of hands now, but Jean first.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Heather. I think DWI are much more positive now about looking at the standards for non-potable for domestic uses. I don't think they see their role in other aspects of non-potable use. So I think really good point, as Jeff said, we need to map where the standards are and the accountable bodies. And I think that's something that we can pick up, Jeff, working with DEFRA and other government departments as well, to actually map where the standards are and who needs to be accountable for those. But really good point, Heather.
No, brilliant. Are you ready? And then I'll bring in John.
Yeah, I guess it's just to build on Jeff's comment as well. So it is right to say that the technology is definitely there to reach to the desired quality and the required quality for whichever use is mapped already in the report, for example, or that pyramid of uses. I think the main challenge here, maybe from a regulatory perspective, is building that confidence to people, to the users, that water is safe to use for whichever purpose we're talking about here. And that's why sometimes, whether it's TWI or other institutions, push for a much stronger treatment or handling of that water than is actually required. And an example is very much the US, for example, where they've done reuse. The water has been bombarded with processes in such a way that the output water is actually cleaner, let's say, than drinking water from the tap, but is a way of building confidence in people about that reuse. And I agree that designing that framework of water quality standards based on a reuse is very much a requirement for this to work. And bringing in George's comments before about costs, how do we balance costs with reuse? That's what would also help tip the balance into a more sustainable way of doing this.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Right, John, I think we're almost out of time, but let's give you the last word. John, what's your question?
Sorry, John Herman, Thames Water. So full disclosure, I'm working closely with George and Jean on the Enabling Water Smart Community project. So yeah, just to say, yeah, really, really good report this that Jess produced. But a few key things is how do we make this easier? So, where George is sat there now, we got Beckton, Europe's largest sewage treatment work. We'd love to get final effluent, from that site across London, feeding a lot of this non-domestic use, all the data centres that are being built in East London. But how do we work with government on that piece of work? How do we work with the local authorities, the GLA, and various other bodies? We all need to come together in the EA and sit around and say, look, this is what the opportunities are, and we're not realising them because we're all too disjointed. So we need to really work on that piece. We need to look at existing technologies. So we're having lots of really good conversations at the moment with companies that can do on-site package plants for final effluent reuse. So we've got sewage treatment work there. 100 meters down the road, they're building data center campuses. There's great opportunities. So we need to really start exploring what's already there and available to us. And finally, it's the big tech. So we all kind of bash big tech, but actually they're all really engaged. So I'm having lots of good conversation with the big companies that we all know and love. They're really keen to get involved with this. They've got very, very challenging water positive targets for data centers. So they're all ears at the moment. So any ideas that we've got, they're very, very keen to listen and get involved with.
I'm tempted to start guessing companies and get you to see whether no, I'm not going to go there. But well, we've run out of time. Jean, I'll turn to you in a second. But before we do so, I'm just wondering whether our panelists have any final words, any kind of concluding statements. So go for George first. Anything final you wanted to add?
I think just I would urge you all to engage on this where there are appropriate, you've seen the recommendations, there will be working groups that come in, task and finish groups. If there is an area of interest, please engage us, get in touch, because we're going to need lots of different stakeholders across this if we're going to see this driven forward.
Yeah, fantastic. And Irene?
I would just add that while reuse is not something new, is not a new concept worldwide, certainly here in the UK, it feels that the momentum is happening now. So I guess that is not to lose that momentum, keep driving that force forward nationally to make that change happen.
Yeah, fantastic. And Jeff, as author, I guess, before I turn to Jean.
Yeah, I agree with both those comments. Please, and please do reach out if you'd like to get more involved in this. I mean, John, you know, again, let's make it as simple as we can. You know, there are some complexities in here. There are safety considerations and so on. But if we want to make this happen at scale, we've got to make it as easy as we can. Thanks.
Fantastic. And over to you, Jean, to wrap up and close.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Daniel. And I always like to have the last word, so thanks for that. So great report and a really good webinar. I think we've covered a lot of ground. I'm not going to go over all of it, but I think a few points that came from the discussion for me. So first of all, the scale of the challenge. So on public water supply, we're facing a deficit of 5 billion litres of water a day by 2050, and that's in the context of 14 billion litres of water. So over a third deficit, and then we need more beyond that for other sectors, for agriculture, for energy, and so on. I think the summary you had, Jeff, that all sources have some potential use, and every use can look at other sources of water. I think the hierarchy of use is a really important step forward. So we need to reflect on how that can be used in taking forward the national framework, so that we're not looking first and foremost at potable water, that we're looking at reducing demand, then reuse, before we're looking at abstraction. And then the hierarchy within reuse. I think around the next steps, I think what came through on that for me was the need for those regulatory next steps. And I think really important is the need to look at that waste and how waste becomes a resource, as well then around the standards that we need for those different forms of reuse, whether it's in a domestic setting or industrial or elsewhere. And I think while the report highlighted some brilliant example of international case studies, I think, as Irene said, we need to now start building the UK case studies to give confidence in the ability to embed reuse in our water resource approaches. And last but not least, collaborative approach. We've got where we are today through collaboration across all sectors and users, and we just need to take that forward and working with government as well to deliver on reuse for the future. So thank you, and thanks again, Jeff, and thanks to WRE for hosting the webinar.